Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever's appropriate. Welcome to the first in our series, new series of Devon and Cornwall Record Society podcasts with authors looking at the history and heritage of Devon and Cornwall. I'm very pleased to say we have our first guest is Mark Stoyle, Professor of History at Southampton. People involved in the history of Devon and Cornwall will know Mark from various books, but in particular the Civil War in Devon, Exeter's water supply, Exeter city walls, a wonderful book on identity in Cornwall. Mark is research-led, and he's going to tell us all about his new book. And I should say that these podcasts are contained to three questions, very straightforward. And so the first one is, tell us about your new book.
Oh, well, thanks, Todd, and thank you for your kind words. This is a book that I've been working on, for 20 years, and it's something that I've been interested in all my life. And it's about one of the most important episodes that ever happened, really, in the West Country, and that is the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549, or the Western Rising of 1549, as it's sometimes known, which was essentially a massive popular protest by the ordinary people of Devon and Cornwall against the religious changes of Edward VI's government. So it's a kind of a religiously conservative or a Catholic pushback against Protestant policies, religious policies being imposed on this region, like the rest of the kingdom, from London. And there was a lot of resistance to it, to those policies really all over the kingdom, lots of people very unhappy, but it was in the West Country that really determined popular opposition was mounted.
Well, I know you've been doing this for a long time. It's been a key interest of yours. And you follow on from Francis Rose Troup, who comes, 2 generations ago and then some. Tell us about your sources.
Well, the sources that I looked at, obviously, as you know from our conversations over the years, Todd, Francis Rose Troup's book is great. She did a wonderful job, I think, for a historian working in the early 20th century when it was much harder to get at sources. And she hoovered up most of what was available and did, a fantastic job, I think, for her time, as I say. People have said that one of the things that makes this rebellion so intriguing is the fact that there's so little evidence about it. And so most of what there was, she did find, but there have been, a number of sort of fragments of material that she hadn't come across. So I've looked at quite a lot of legal records in the National Archives in London, and they tell us quite a lot about interpersonal disputes that were taking place after the rebellion, and there are many echoes of the rebellion in those. Just to give you one example, I found in one of these legal cases that the two gentlemen who led the rebellion, Humphrey Arundel and Winslade, who was a Cornishman, they were the two Cornish gentlemen, at least, who led that part of the rising. There were a number of writings and letters that they actually circulated when they got involved in ongoing legal disputes. They sort of took it on themselves to sort those disputes out while they were in control in the West Country. And a particular petitioner to one of the King's courts some years later said that he still had a mass of writings that Arundel and Winslade had sort of sent to him. And of course, those have now been lost. There's no trace of those today, but at least we know that once they still existed. So I've looked at legal records. I've obviously looked at lots of financial records, and those turned up interesting things about the siege of Plymouth and the siege of Exeter that we didn't know before. And I've also been looking very closely at the writings of John Hooker. And you and I have known John Hooker almost, all of our working lives. Obviously famous for all of the work he carried out on Exeter, but he was also the key chronicler of the Western Rising. So I've used his sources very intensively, his account of the rebellion, but I've also looked at it quite suspiciously in a way, because obviously Hooker was a loyalist. He was in Exeter when it was besieged by the rebels. He very much saw the loyalists, the pro-Protestants or proto-Protestants, if you like, as the good guys and the rebels as the bad guys. And I think this whole episode of the Western Rising has always been seen through Hooker's glasses. And what I've tried to do is to use his work, of course, but to draw on as many other possible sources as I can in order to try and give the rebels' perspective as well, wherever that's possible. Not an easy task, but I think I have managed to take us away from concentrating almost solely on Hooker's words and look at lots of other evidence as well.
Yeah, I think what's remarkable of the book, which I have right here, is this, careful use of the sources. And the sources tell us lots, but you're very good at saying what they don't say.
Yeah.
Those gaps and the questions that you have. What's do you think really surprised you after, you've been thinking about it, you've been researching it, but when you finally do the writing, it becomes something else. What actually did you think, oh, now that's interesting, I hadn't thought about that, or didn't really think this would come out of it?
I mean, so many things, Todd, that there's not really time to cover all of the things that have surprised me. I think one thing is just the sheer bloodiness of this episode. I mean, I say somewhere in the book, this was the biggest catastrophe to hit the West Country between the Black Death and the English Civil War. We think that perhaps as many as 4,000 local men were killed in the suppression of the Rising. And when you think how much smaller the population of Devon and Cornwall was at that time, this is an enormous figure. And I mean, I think this Rising and its aftermath sort of hit the West Country like a meteorite, and the reverberations echoed down for at least a century later. So I think the sheer impact of the Rising on local people, the extent of the killing, the extent of the punishment which followed, I mean, that's been one thing that's really surprised me. And some of the awful punishments that were handed out to the rebels. And I think the other things really stem from the points that you've already asked about sources. And I think looking at those sources in perhaps a slightly more skeptical way and trying to squeeze them for as much evidence as we can find, two particular things stood out. I mean, I've praised Frances Rose Troop's book already, and I think it's a great book. But I think that she was misled by one date in an indictment that was drawn up against the rebels later, which I think caused her to misdate, the Cornish part of the rebellion. So I think things happened there. The chronology there was rather different from what she originally suggested. And that has lots of implications for what followed. That was one thing. And I think the other thing is that it's often been said that this Rising was very much sort of a class war episode. And that is built almost solely on one piece of evidence, which is a later legal indictment, which states that the rebels shouted, "Kill all the gentlemen." Now, that's been repeated ad infinitum in all of the studies of the Rising, as you know. But it suddenly dawned on me when I was researching this book that that's virtually the only evidence for sort of real class hatred in the Western Rising. And of course, when I went to look at it, I realized this piece of evidence comes from an indictment against the rebel leaders that was drawn up by the government's own lawyers after the Rising was over. So what it's clearly trying to do is to suggest that the rebels were driven by class hatred and to sort of tarnish them with this idea of being crazed class warriors, to turn all of the gentry and all of perhaps the yeomen and the more prosperous people against them. But I mean, I think it was probably a blatant lie. It's almost the only piece of evidence I've seen for real class hatred in the Western Rising. And I think this was simply done to tarnish the rebels' names after the Rising was over. So again, it's an example of spin and trickery and how the small amounts of evidence that we have can be very misleading.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a fascinating topic, but I think what you've done with it, Frances Rose Troop would be, I think, very pleased that you pushed it all that further along. And for anybody interested in following up, Murderous Midsummer, the Western Rebellion of 1549, published by Yale, available through any good bookseller. It deserves to do really well, but I think it's a classic in the making. In a few years' time, I think it's going to be one of those books that sits on many bookshelves because it's an important topic and you've done it justice.
Oh, thank you, Todd. Well, you've seen it developing over the years. The conversations that you and I have had together have been so valuable. And I mean, it is like all works of scholarship. It stands on the shoulders of so many other people. And I felt that very strongly when I was doing this. The work, obviously, we've mentioned Rose Troop, your own work, lots of other scholars I've encountered. And I think the other thing is that this is an event in West Country history that not just local historians, but, the greatest historians of the Tudor period have looked at and commented on as well. So it's nice to be able to bring the work that we're doing sort of on the West Country history into that dialogue with that sort of broader sort of push of history on the Tudor period. And that's another thing about this book that I've really enjoyed.
Well, we're lucky to have the book. We're lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have you share it with our viewers and our listeners and our readers. So thank you very much, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Todd. That's so kind. Thank you.
All right. Cheerio, everyone.
Bye.